The idea had seemed innocent enough. Danny, always the ringleader of their misadventures, proposed the outing after hearing rumors about the zoo's eerie atmosphere at night. No crowds, no rules, just us and the animals, he had said with a grin that masked his lack of foresight. The zoo, officially closed after dark, held an unexplainable allure. It was the perfect setting for their thrill-seeking group. Danny, the fearless leader. Rachel, the skeptic who tagged along for Danny. Marcus, the self-proclaimed documentary filmmaker. And Sarah, the quiet one whose nervous glances were often overlooked. Together, they were an odd mix of curiosity and recklessness. But tonight, they were united in their pursuit of the extraordinary. The air was cool and thick with the scent of damp earth as they slipped through a gap in the outer fence, their flashlights piercing the darkness. From the moment they stepped inside, the zoo felt different. By day, it was a lively, almost magical place teeming with families and laughter. At night, it was silent, almost reverent, as if the animals themselves were holding their breath. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the faint rustling of leaves became magnified into a symphony of unease. "Are we sure this is a good idea?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't chicken out now," Danny replied, his tone light but edged with impatience. He led them deeper into the zoo, past familiar exhibits that now felt unfamiliar in the absence of light and noise. The lion's enclosure loomed ahead, its once majestic display reduced to a yawning void. Danny shone his flashlight into the pen, revealing nothing but empty space. "No lions tonight," he said with a shrug. "Guess they're sleeping?" Marcus aimed his camera at the dark enclosure, muttering something about capturing the eerie ambience. The lens caught a glint of something in the distance, eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam. But when he blinked, they were gone. He chose not to mention it. The group pressed on, their path taking them away from the main walkways and into the lesser-known corners of the zoo. It was here that the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew colder, carrying with it a faint, unpleasant odor, something metallic and decayed. Rachel wrinkled her nose. "Does anyone else smell that?" she asked, but Danny brushed her off. "Probably just the animals," he said dismissively. "Come on, there's supposed to be an old section of the zoo that no one talks about. Let's find it." As they ventured further, the terrain became uneven, overgrown with weeds and vines that seemed to reclaim the zoo's forgotten corners. They stumbled upon a rusted gate with a sign so faded it was illegible. Beyond it lay a narrow path, flanked by towering trees that seemed to swallow the moonlight. Danny, undeterred, pushed the gate open with a metallic screech that echoed unnervingly. "This must be it," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. The forgotten path. Sarah hesitated at the gate, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Maybe we shouldn't," she said softly. Her words were ignored as Danny led the charge, with Marcus eagerly filming and Rachel reluctantly following. With a sigh, Sarah brought up the rear, her steps slow and reluctant. The path led them to an area unlike the rest of the zoo. The enclosures here were dilapidated, their fences leaning precariously and their signs covered in grime. The cages, once homes to exotic creatures, were now empty and dark, but they didn't feel abandoned. There was a presence, an unseen force that prickled the skin and quickened the heart. "Guys, this place is seriously messed up," Rachel said, her bravado faltering. "We should head back." Before anyone could respond, a low, mournful howl broke the silence. It was not the howl of a wolf or any animal they recognized. It was something deeper, almost human in its anguish. The sound sent shivers down their spines, rooting them to the spot. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered, his camera now shaking in his grip. Danny, for the first time that night, seemed unsure. "Probably just an animal," he said, but his words lacked conviction. The howl came again, closer this time, and with it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was out, there wasn't confined by cages. Panic set in as they realized the depth of their mistake. The zoo wasn't theirs to explore after dark. It belonged to something else, something they weren't prepared to meet. The howl lingered in their ears like a sinister melody, refusing to fade even as the group huddled together. Sarah's flashlight flickered weakly, as if the batteries sensed her fear. Marcus adjusted his camera, the faint red recording light glowing in the dark. "Let's head back," Rachel urged, her voice trembling. "Whatever's out here isn't part of the tour." Danny, ever the leader, attempted to mask his own unease. "We came this far. We're not running just because of some creepy sounds. It's probably a leftover recording system or something. Zoos use that stuff to scare off trespassers." His explanation was plausible enough to silence further protests, though not their growing anxiety. The group pressed on, their footsteps crunching against the overgrown gravel path. The enclosures they passed were unlike anything they'd seen before. The fencing was crude and reinforced, as if it had been designed to contain something far more dangerous than typical zoo animals. One cage, larger than the others, bore deep gouges in the steel bars, as though some monstrous creature had clawed at them in fury. Sarah stopped to stare at it, her breath shallow. "What could have done this?" she murmured. Marcus captured the scene on his camera, zooming in on the claw marks. "Whatever it was," he said, "it had to be huge." His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Ahead, Danny paused at an ancient sign hanging crookedly from a pole. He rubbed away years of grime to reveal faded lettering. "Restricted area. Do not enter." Below it was a smaller, handwritten edition. "They are watching." Rachel read the warning aloud, her voice faltering at the last words. "Still think it's just leftover recordings, Danny?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Signs like this are meant to keep people out," he replied. "That's all?" He forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. The truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. The deeper they ventured, the less the zoo felt like a place of wonder. It felt like a prison, or perhaps a graveyard. As they rounded a corner, the path opened into a clearing. In its center stood a decrepit building, its windows shattered and its walls streaked with blackened scorch marks. A plaque near the entrance read, "Experimental Habitat Center." The words sent a chill through the group, conjuring images of unnatural experiments and hidden horrors. Danny approached the building cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the graffiti that adorned its exterior. Most of it was nonsensical, symbols, names, dates, but one phrase stood out, scrawled in thick red paint. "You are not alone." "Let's not go in there," Sarah said firmly, her voice breaking through the tension. "We don't know what's inside, and I don't want to find out." Danny hesitated, his usual bravado wavering. Before he could respond, a sudden clattering noise came from behind them. It was loud and metallic, as though something had deliberately slammed into one of the enclosures they'd passed earlier. The group spun around, their flashlights darting through the shadows, but the source of the noise remained hidden. "Someone's out here with us," Rachel whispered, gripping Marcus's arm. "Maybe it's security," Marcus suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Then why don't they just yell at us to leave?" Rachel snapped back, her fear sharpening her tone. The clattering came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of labored breathing. It was heavy, uneven, and wrong, as if the lungs producing it belonged to something unnatural. The group instinctively backed toward the building, their fear of the unseen greater than their fear of what might lie within. "Inside," Danny hissed. "We can barricade the door if we have to." Reluctantly, they followed him into the dilapidated structure. The air inside was stale and damp, carrying the faint stench of decay. Broken furniture and scattered papers littered the floor, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the space. Marcus swept his camera across the room, capturing every detail. Sarah moved to the nearest window and peered outside. "I don't see anything," she whispered. Her relief was short-lived, however, as a new sound rose from the darkness outside. A deep, guttural growl, vibrating through the air and into their bones. Whatever was out there wasn't human, and it was getting closer. Danny shut the door, his hands trembling as he slid an old metal desk in front of it for good measure. "We'll wait here until morning," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The others nodded, their fear rendering them silent. Outside, the growling continued, joined by the faint sound of claws scraping against stone. It was hunting them, and no one dared to ask what would happen if it found them. Inside the decaying structure, the group's fear was palpable. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself resented their presence. Danny paced near the barricaded door, his bravado now entirely replaced by nervous energy. Rachel sat on an overturned chair, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while Sarah knelt near the window, peering out with dread etched across her face. Marcus, the only one still holding onto his camera, filmed the room in silence, his lens sweeping over the peeling walls and shattered furniture. "This place gives me the creeps," Rachel muttered. "Why would they even build something like this in a zoo?" "It must have been abandoned years ago," Danny replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He glanced at the papers strewn across the floor, some of them yellowed with age. Curious, he picked one up, squinting at the faded text under the weak beam of his flashlight. "What does it say?" Sarah asked without looking away from the window. "It's a report, I think," Danny said slowly. Subject 7 shows increased aggression when exposed to isolation protocols. Further testing required. He frowned and dropped the paper, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I don't like this." Sarah turned from the window, her face pale. "Whatever they were testing, it's still out there. I saw something moving. It's circling the building." Rachel shot to her feet, panic flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean, something? Like, what kind of something?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "It's too dark, but it's big. Bigger than any animal I've ever seen." Danny moved to the window, his flashlight aimed into the abyss beyond the glass. The beam caught only shifting shadows and swaying branches. "Maybe it's just a bear," he offered weakly. "A bear doesn't growl like that," Marcus interjected, his voice unnaturally calm. "And bears don't circle prey. They attack." He adjusted his camera and moved toward a doorway leading deeper into the building. "We need to find another exit. If whatever's out there breaks in, we're trapped." Reluctantly, the others agreed, following Marcus into a dark corridor that reeked of mildew and rust. The hallway was narrow, with doors on either side leading to what appeared to be observation rooms. One of the doors hung open, and Danny's flashlight revealed a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor. Rusted restraints dangled from its sides, and the walls were lined with shelves containing broken glass vials and faded labels. "This isn't a zoo," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. It's some kind of lab? Experimental Habitat Center," Marcus muttered, quoting the plaque they had seen earlier. "They weren't keeping animals here. They were doing something to them." Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from the front of the building. The group froze, their hearts pounding as the growling returned, louder and more guttural than before. Whatever was outside was no longer circling. It was testing the barricade. "Run," Danny whispered. He didn't wait for a reply, sprinting down the hallway. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The corridor twisted and turned, each corner revealing more of the building's sinister purpose. They passed another observation room, this one containing a shattered enclosure that looked like it once held something alive. As they rounded the next corner, Marcus stopped abruptly, nearly causing Sarah to crash into him. "What is it?" she hissed. He pointed ahead. At the end of the hallway stood a door marked emergency exit, but between them and salvation was a large, deep gouge in the floor. The concrete had been torn away, revealing a gaping hole that descended into darkness. The edges of the pit were jagged, as if something had clawed its way through the ground. "Great," Rachel said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What now?" Before Danny could respond, the crashing from the front of the building grew louder, followed by a sound that froze them all. The screech of metal bending. The barricade was failing. "We jump," Danny said, his voice firm despite his fear. "It's not that far across." "You're kidding," Rachel snapped. "What if we fall? What if it's down there? Then we die anyway if we stay here." Danny shot back. He took a deep breath, backed up a few steps, and ran toward the pit. His leap was clumsy, but he managed to land on the other side, stumbling but unhurt. "Go," he shouted. Sarah was next, her small frame barely clearing the gap. Marcus handed Rachel his camera before leaping himself, his landing more graceful than Danny's. Rachel hesitated, clutching the camera to her chest. Behind her, the crashing stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy moving through the building. "Rachel now?" Danny yelled. With a panic scream, she ran and jumped, her foot slipping on the edge as she landed. Marcus grabbed her arm and pulled her up just as a shadow emerged at the end of the hallway. It was massive, its eyes gleaming in the darkness as a low growl reverberated through the air. "Run!" Danny shouted again, leading them toward the emergency exit. Behind them, the creature roared, its guttural cry shaking the walls. Bursting through the emergency exit, the group stumbled into the crisp night air, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The towering trees outside the experimental building swayed ominously in the wind, their branches clawing at the moonlight like skeletal fingers. The roar from the building reverberated behind them, followed by the sharp clang of metal crashing to the floor. Whatever had been inside was now free. "Keep moving," Danny barked, his voice tight with fear. He grabbed Sarah's hand and led the group down a narrow trail flanked by overgrown shrubs. The path wound deeper into the zoo, the overgrowth encroaching until the air felt stifling, almost alive. "What was that thing?" Rachel gasped, clutching her side as they ran. "I don't know," Danny replied, "but we're not sticking around to find out." As they hurried through the underbrush, Marcus suddenly stopped, his camera pointed toward the dense foliage. "Wait," he said in a whisper. "There's something moving up ahead." The group froze, their flashlights darting toward the trees. For a moment, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, the cacophony of crickets and rustling leaves silenced, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then, a figure stepped into the path. At first, the group thought it was another person, tall, hunched, and clad in tattered clothing. But as the flashlight beams illuminated its face, they recoiled in horror. The figure's skin was sallow and mottled, its eyes sunken but gleaming with a predatory light. Most horrifying of all was its mouth, stretched unnaturally wide, revealing jagged, discolored teeth. "Turn back," the figure growled, its voice raspy and guttural, like metal scraping against stone. "You don't belong here." Danny stepped forward cautiously, his hands raised. "We don't mean any harm. We're just trying to get out of here." The creature tilted its head, studying him with an eerie stillness. "There is no out," it rasped, "only deeper." Before anyone could react, a deafening roar split the night air, sending the group into a panic. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and its body tensed as if preparing for a fight. Without another word, it melted into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "What the hell was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Something that wasn't supposed to exist," Marcus said grimly, gripping his camera like a lifeline. "Let's keep moving before whatever's chasing us finds us again." The group pressed on, the path becoming more treacherous with each step. The ground was littered with broken branches and exposed roots, making every movement a struggle. As they trudged forward, Sarah noticed something strange. The air felt colder, almost unnaturally so, and the trees around them seemed to lean closer, their gnarled branches forming an oppressive canopy. Finally, the trail opened into a clearing. At its center stood a dilapidated shack, its roof caved in on one side and its windows covered in grime. A rusted sign leaned precariously against the wall, its faded lettering barely legible. "Keeper's Quarters." "Do we really want to go in there?" Rachel asked, eyeing the structure warily. "We don't have a choice," Danny replied. "If that thing is still behind us, we need to hide." The group approached the shack cautiously, their flashlights casting eerie shadows across its weathered surface. Marcus pushed the door open with a creak, revealing a small, cluttered room filled with dusty furniture and animal bones. A battered journal lay open on a table, its pages yellowed and curling with age. Marcus picked it up and began to read aloud. Day 47. The subjects grow restless. The mutations have accelerated beyond expectations. Subject 7 is the most dangerous, but the others are learning from it. They are communicating. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. Day 62. The keeper is missing. Found only his boots outside the habitat. They're hunting us now. What kind of zoo is this? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It's not a zoo, Marcus replied grimly, closing the journal. It's a lab disguised as one. They were experimenting on animals and people. Before they could process this revelation, a low growl echoed from the forest, closer this time. The group tensed, their flashlights darting to the tree line. Rachel grabbed the journal, clutching it to her chest as if it were a shield. We need to leave. Now. Danny nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the darkness. They weren't alone, and the forest was no longer just a place to hide. It had become a trap, and the predators were closing in. The group's breath came in short gasps as they fled the clearing, plunging deeper into the tangled heart of the zoo. The journal's horrifying revelations weighed heavily on them, but fear kept them moving. Rachel clung to the book, her knuckles white, while Marcus, ever the documentarian, continued filming, his camera now their only witness. Behind them, guttural growls and the crunch of leaves warned that their pursuers were drawing closer. Where are we even going? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with panic. I don't know, Danny admitted, sweat dripping from his brow. We just need to find someplace they can't get to us. There has to be a safe spot somewhere in this damn zoo. The terrain became uneven, forcing them to navigate a series of shallow ravines. Broken fences jutted out at odd angles, their jagged edges evidence of the chaos that must have occurred here years ago. As they crested a small hill, the group froze in unison. Before them was the zoo's centerpiece, the grand aviary dome, an enormous geodesic structure of rusted metal and shattered glass. The dome loomed like a forgotten relic, its frame twisted in places as if crushed by some unimaginable force. Inside, shadows flitted and danced, and the distant sound of wings brushing against the structure created an eerie, constant hum. We're going in there? Rachel asked, her voice shaking. It's either that or wait for whatever's chasing us to catch up, Danny replied grimly. They approached the dome cautiously, stepping through a gap in the fencing. Once inside, they were greeted by a surreal sight, the remnants of a lush, tropical habitat gone feral. Vines hung from the dome's framework, their leaves thick and waxy. Pools of murky water dotted the ground, and the skeletal remains of what might have been birds lay scattered among the overgrowth. The air was humid, tinged with the metallic scent of decay. This place is a graveyard, Marcus muttered, panning his camera across the scene. As they ventured further into the aviary, the sounds outside faded, replaced by the rustling of unseen creatures in the foliage. Rachel clutched Danny's arm, her flashlight darting from one shadow to the next. Do you think they're in here? She whispered. They're everywhere, Sarah said quietly, her eyes scanning the treetops. I can feel it. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Near the center of the dome, they discovered a large, rusted cage. Inside, a pile of bones and feathers lay undisturbed, as if the creature that once lived there had decayed in place. Hanging from the cage door was a sign that read, Subject 3, Apex Harpy. A harpy? Marcus asked, lowering his camera. They were trying to create mythological creatures? Not just trying, Rachel said, pointing to the journal. They succeeded. The thing outside, and whatever's in here, they're not natural. There's something else? Before anyone could respond, a loud screech echoed through the dome, piercing and alien. The group spun toward the sound, their flashlights revealing a massive shadow descending from the rafters. The creature landed with a deafening crash, its talons sinking into the earth. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The harpy stood on muscular legs, its talons razor-sharp and glinting in the flashlight beams. Its wings were enormous, tattered but powerful, and its face, a grotesque fusion of bird and human, was twisted in a permanent snarl. The creature's eyes glowed a fiery orange, and it let out another ear-splitting screech before lunging toward them. Run! Danny shouted, shoving Sarah forward. The group scattered, each of them darting through the thick underbrush in a desperate attempt to escape. The harpy moved with terrifying speed, its wings propelling it through the air as it hunted them. Marcus ducked behind a fallen tree, his camera still recording, while Rachel and Sarah sprinted toward the far end of the dome. Danny tried to draw the creature's attention, throwing a rock at its back. "Hey, over here," he yelled. The harpy turned, its glowing eyes locking onto Danny. It lunged toward him, its talons slashing through the air, but he managed to dive out of the way at the last second. The creature slammed into the ground, sending up a cloud of dirt and debris. Rachel and Sarah reached what appeared to be an emergency hatch at the edge of the dome. "It's locked," Rachel cried, tugging at the handle. "No, it's stuck," Sarah said, throwing her weight against the door. With a metallic groan, the hatch creaked open just enough for them to squeeze through. "Marcus! Danny!" Rachel screamed, waving them over. Marcus emerged from his hiding spot, sprinting toward the hatch with the harpy close behind. Danny was right on his heels, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Go, go, go," he yelled. As Marcus dove through the hatch, Danny turned and hurled a rock at the harpy, buying himself just enough time to slip through before slamming the door shut. The harpy's talons scraped against the metal, its screeches echoing through the dome as the group collapsed on the ground outside, gasping for air. For a moment, silence fell over them. Then Marcus held up his camera, his hands shaking. "I got it," he said, his voice trembling. "I filmed the whole thing." "Great," Danny muttered, pulling himself to his feet. "Now let's figure out how to survive long enough for anyone to see it." Unbeknownst to them, a pair of glowing eyes watched from the shadows beyond the hatch, their fiery gaze filled with something disturbingly human. The group barely had time to catch their breath before the sounds of distant growls began to creep through the trees. The night was suffocatingly dark. The moonlight filtered through thick, tangled branches that seemed to close in around them. Every step away from the dome felt heavier, as if the zoo itself resisted their escape. Marcus clutched his camera like a talisman, its blinking red light a feeble promise that someone, somewhere, might one day see what they had endured. "Where do we go now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. "We stick together and keep moving," Danny said firmly, scanning the area with his flashlight. "If we stop, we're dead. But what's the plan?" Rachel pressed, her voice tinged with desperation. "We can't just keep running aimlessly. We need to." Her words were cut off by a low, guttural sound, chillingly close. Everyone froze, their flashlights converging on a patch of dense underbrush. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, with alarming suddenness, a small animal darted out. A raccoon, its fur matted and eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The group exhaled in collective relief, but the moment was short-lived. "Don't let your guard down," Marcus muttered, though his hands were shaking. "This place plays tricks." As they pressed on, the forest seemed to warp around them. Trails looped back on themselves, landmarks appeared and disappeared, and the air felt colder with every passing minute. Sarah began to notice strange whispers in the distance, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the cadence was too deliberate, too human. "Do you hear that?" she asked, gripping Danny's arm. "Hear what?" he replied, his brow furrowed. "The voices," she said. They're talking." Danny shook his head. "It's just your nerves. This place is messing with us." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispers grew louder, their words just beyond comprehension. She could feel them pressing against her mind, like icy fingers brushing her consciousness. She looked at Rachel and Marcus to see if they noticed, but their expressions suggested they were too preoccupied with the physical threats to notice the mental ones. Eventually, they stumbled upon an old service tunnel entrance, its rusted metal door hanging ajar. Faded lettering on the wall read, "Subterranean Habitat Access." The air that wafted out was damp and rank, carrying with it the faint sound of dripping water. "Do we really want to go underground?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "Isn't that just trapping ourselves?" "We can't stay out here," Danny replied. "Those things could be tracking us right now. At least down there, we'll have walls around us." The group hesitated, but the growing intensity of the whispers and the distant sound of heavy footsteps left them with little choice. One by one, they descended into the tunnel, the beam of Marcus's camera light cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with peeling paint and pipes that groaned as if alive. Every sound echoed unnaturally, creating the sensation that something was following just a step behind. As they moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, now clearly forming fragmented sentences. "Why are they here?" one voice seemed to ask. "They don't belong," another hissed. Sarah clutched her ears, but the voices only grew clearer, seeping into her thoughts like ink spreading through water. "Stop!" she cried suddenly, causing the others to jump. "What's wrong?" Danny asked, spinning around. "Can't you hear them?" she demanded, her eyes wide with terror. "They're in my head. They're talking to me." "Sarah, calm down," Rachel said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's just the stress. We're all hearing things." "No, it's not stress," Sarah yelled, pulling away. They're telling me we're not supposed to be here, that we need to leave, or..." Her words were drowned out by a deafening roar that reverberated through the tunnel, shaking the ground beneath them. The group's flashlights flickered, and for a terrifying moment, the darkness was absolute. When the lights stabilized, they revealed a massive shadow at the far end of the tunnel, its hulking form too large to fully fit within the narrow space. "Run!" Danny shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her forward. The group bolted down the corridor, their footsteps echoing in a cacophony of panic. The shadow pursued them, its guttural growls growing louder with every step. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the faint glimmer of another exit always just out of reach. Finally, they burst into a larger chamber, its walls covered in strange, organic growths that pulsed faintly with an eerie green light. At its center stood a massive glass enclosure, cracked but intact. Inside, something stirred, a figure that was human-like but distorted, its limbs elongated and its face obscured by a mass of writhing tendrils. It pressed its hands against the glass, as if sensing their presence. "What the hell is that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's another one of their experiments," Marcus said, his camera trembling in his hands. "This place, it's not a zoo. It's a tomb." Before they could process this new horror, the sound of their pursuer drew closer. The group exchanged panicked glances, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. There was no way out except back the way they came, and that path was no longer an option. As the whispers surged in Sarah's mind, she suddenly understood. "It's watching us," she said, her voice hollow, "and it's waiting for us to make the wrong move." The pulsating green light from the walls gave the chamber an otherworldly glow, casting shifting shadows across the group. The tendril-faced figure inside the cracked glass enclosure remained eerily still, its unnaturally long limbs pressed against the barrier as if it was studying them. Marcus, unable to resist the lure of documenting the inexplicable, moved closer with his camera, the red recording light reflecting off the glass. "Don't get too close," Danny hissed, yanking Marcus back. "We don't know what it is, or what it can do." "It hasn't moved," Marcus whispered back. "It's trapped in there. Maybe we can what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp with panic. "Release it? Are you insane? It could be worse than whatever's chasing us." Rachel, standing near one of the walls, tentatively touched the glowing organic growth. Her fingertips sank slightly into its pliable surface, and she recoiled with a shudder. "These walls, they're alive," she muttered, wiping her hand on her pants. "That's impossible," Danny said, but his eyes betrayed his unease. "It's probably some kind of mold or..." A loud crack interrupted him, drawing everyone's attention back to the glass enclosure. A jagged fracture had spread across the surface like a spider's web, originating from where the creature's tendrils now pressed more firmly against the glass. The air grew heavy with a low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the figure, vibrating deep in their chests. "We need to get out of here now," Sarah said, backing toward the nearest tunnel. I don't care where we go. Anywhere but here. Marcus hesitated, torn between his survival instincts and his desire to capture what could be groundbreaking footage. But before he could voice his decision, the hum intensified, drowning out all other sounds. It felt like the walls themselves were vibrating in response. The tendrils on the creature's face began to writhe, slithering across the cracked glass like living wires seeking an escape. Then, the whispers returned. They were louder now, overlapping voices that filled the chamber with an unbearable cacophony. You should not have come, they chanted in unison. You do not belong. Sarah clutched her ears, tears streaming down her face as she screamed. Make it stop. Please make it stop. Rachel grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. Sarah, focus. We can't fall apart now. Danny pointed toward a smaller tunnel on the far side of the chamber, barely visible through the dim light. That way. We'll figure out the rest once we're out of here. As they sprinted toward the opening, the humming abruptly ceased, plunging the room into an eerie silence. But the quiet was short-lived. A deafening shatter erupted behind them, followed by a guttural, unearthly roar. The creature was free. They didn't look back. The sound of its elongated limbs scraping against the floor drove them forward, their footsteps pounding against the cold metal ground. The tunnel narrowed the farther they went, forcing them to move single file. Marcus, at the back, dared to glance over his shoulder. What he saw made him stumble, a mass of tendrils spilling into the corridor, writhing like serpents as the creature's twisted form slithered after them. This way, Danny shouted, pulling the group toward a side passage. The air grew colder as they ran, their breath visible in the dim light. The tunnel opened into a smaller room, its walls lined with control panels covered in dust and grime. A single screen flickered faintly, displaying static. What is this place? Rachel asked, panting. It looks like some kind of control room, Danny said, flipping switches and pressing buttons in a frantic attempt to make sense of the equipment. The static on the screen briefly cleared, revealing an image of the zoo grounds. But it wasn't the serene landscape they remembered. It was overgrown with the same pulsating green growth, and shadowy figures moved unnaturally across the paths. This place hasn't been a zoo for a long time, Marcus said, his voice shaking. They've been experimenting. On the animals, on the environment, maybe even on people. Sarah, still trembling from the whispers, stared at the screen in horror. Why didn't they stop? Why didn't anyone shut this down? They probably couldn't, Rachel said grimly. Not after whatever they unleashed. Before they could say more, the tendrils began to seep through the cracks in the walls, their movements deliberate and menacing. The group scrambled to find another exit, but the room had no visible doors besides the one they entered through. The creature's growls echoed down the corridor, growing closer with each passing second. There has to be another way out, Rachel shouted, frantically scanning the room. Marcus pointed to a vent near the ceiling, partially hidden behind a stack of overturned chairs. There! We can climb up! With no time to debate, they worked together to move the chairs, creating a makeshift ladder. Danny climbed first, pulling Sarah up after him. Marcus handed Rachel his camera before hoisting himself into the vent. The tendrils began to snake into the room, wrapping around the overturned chairs and pulling them away. Hurry! Danny shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her into the narrow duct just as the last chair was yanked down. The tendrils thrashed angrily beneath them, but the group kept crawling, the metallic vent creaking ominously under their weight. As they moved deeper into the ventilation system, the whispers faded, replaced by a distant, rhythmic pounding. It sounded like a heartbeat, echoing through the metal walls. None of them spoke, too afraid of what they might discover next. The metallic vent rattled under their weight as the group pressed forward, the rhythmic pounding growing louder with each movement. It sounded less like a heartbeat now and more like a deep, labored breathing, as though the very walls of the vent system were alive. The air was thick and damp, carrying an earthy, metallic scent that clung to their throats. Sarah, crawling just behind Danny, whispered, "Do you feel that?" Her voice quivered as she paused mid-crawl, pressing her hand against the vent surface. It pulsed under her palm, faintly but undeniably alive. Danny turned his head to respond, his expression grim. "Keep moving. Whatever's behind us won't stop because the walls are creepy." Rachel, at the back of the group, tightened her grip on Marcus's camera, which she had reluctantly accepted when they climbed into the vent. The blinking red light offered the only comfort in the dark, signaling that someone might eventually see their story, if they survived to tell it. "I don't think we should stay in here much longer," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of their scraping movements. "We're trapped if that thing finds us." Marcus, crawling in front of her, glanced over his shoulder. "You think I don't know that? We'll find an exit soon." His sentence was cut short as his hand sank into a patch of the vent's floor that gave way like wet clay. He recoiled, shaking off a viscous, greenish substance that clung to his skin. "What is that?" Sarah exclaimed, recoiling from the sight. "It's spreading," Rachel said, pointing to the green ooze that now seemed to pulse and expand, creeping up the vent walls. The once sturdy metal groaned as the substance consumed it, the rhythmic breathing intensifying as though in response to their presence. Panic rippled through the group as the vent suddenly lurched, tilting downward at an impossible angle. Danny yelled, "Hold on to something!" But there was nothing to grip. The metal walls became slick with the green substance, and one by one, they slid helplessly into the darkness below. The group landed hard on a spongy surface that cushioned their fall, but clung to their bodies like tar. Marcus groaned, pushing himself upright, only to recoil as he realized the floor beneath him was pulsating. It wasn't just alive, it was aware. The breathing they'd heard in the vents now surrounded them, loud and suffocating, as if the chamber itself were drawing air into unseen lungs. "What is this place?" Rachel said, her voice cracking as she tried to free herself from the sticky floor. Danny scanned the room, his flashlight revealing walls covered in pulsating tendrils that seemed to stretch infinitely into the darkness. At the far end of the chamber, a grotesque structure loomed, a massive, organic heart-like organ suspended by cords of fleshy material. It throbbed in time with the breathing, each pulse sending a wave of green light through the room. "This isn't just an experiment gone wrong," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "This is the creature. The zoo isn't just a building, it's alive." The realization settled over them like a suffocating weight. They weren't in a containment facility for animals. They were inside the creature itself, and everything they had encountered, the tendrils, the ooze, the whispers, was part of its body, part of its trap. The organic floor began to shift beneath them, the sticky substance dragging them toward the pulsating heart. Sarah screamed, clawing at the ground in a futile attempt to stop her slow descent. "It's pulling us in," she cried. "Don't fight it," Danny said, surprising everyone with his calm tone. "It's a system. It's reacting to us like an immune response. If we fight it, it'll only push harder. We need to think." Marcus, trying to hold his camera steady, pointed it toward the heart. "You're saying we should just let it absorb us? That's your plan?" "No," Danny said, his eyes fixed on the cord suspending the heart. "We cut it off at the source. If this heart is controlling everything, maybe we can shut it down." The words hung in the air as the group exchanged uncertain glances. Rachel was the first to act, grabbing a shard of jagged metal that had fallen from the vent. "I'm not dying in here," she said, her voice resolute. "If this thing wants us gone, we'll give it a reason to regret it." The others followed her lead, tearing off pieces of the floor or grabbing loose fragments from their surroundings. The heart's pulses quickened, as if it sensed their intentions. The walls trembled, and the breathing grew erratic, filling the chamber with a deafening roar. The creature was awake, and it was angry. The chamber roared to life, an unholy symphony of guttural groans, throbbing vibrations, and the relentless hiss of tendrils slithering toward their prey. The pulsing organ at the center of the room began to glow brighter with each beat, sending rippling waves of green light across the walls, illuminating the terror etched on their faces. It wasn't just the creature reacting. It was preparing to defend itself. Danny stood at the forefront, clutching a jagged piece of metal he had pried from the vent. His knuckles were white, and his breath came in quick, shallow bursts, but his resolve remained firm. "We hit it hard and fast," he shouted over the cacophony. "Go for the cords. It can't function if it's severed." Rachel darted to the left, using the dim, pulsing light to navigate the shifting floor. Each step was a struggle as the spongy surface clung to her boots, as though trying to pull her down. She reached the nearest cord, its surface slick and pulsating, and struck with all her might. The shard of metal sliced through the outer layer, releasing a spray of viscous, glowing liquid that hissed and bubbled as it hit the floor. The creature reacted instantly. The walls trembled violently, and a deafening screech reverberated through the chamber, forcing everyone to cover their ears. The tendrils lashed out wildly, their movements frantic and unpredictable. One wrapped around Rachel's ankle, yanking her off her feet and dragging her toward the heart. She screamed, clawing at the floor as the others rushed to her aid. Marcus reached her first, swinging his metal shard like a machete, slicing through the tendril with a sickening snap. The severed appendage writhed on the floor before dissolving into a puddle of green ooze. "Get up!" Marcus yelled, pulling Rachel to her feet. "We're not done yet." Meanwhile, Sarah and Danny focused on the cord suspending the heart. Sarah had managed to sever one, and the organ now hung lopsided, its pulses erratic and uneven. Each severed cord sent shockwaves through the chamber, making it harder to stay on their feet. The creature's defenses grew more desperate, with tendrils swarming like an enraged hive, their movements faster and more coordinated. "We need to cut them all at once," Danny shouted, dodging a tendril that whipped past his head. "If we take too long, it'll adapt." The group regrouped near the heart, their faces slick with sweat and glowing liquid. They shared a silent nod of understanding, their collective determination outweighing their fear. As one, they charged the remaining cords, hacking and slashing with every ounce of strength they had left. The creature fought back with everything it could muster. Tendrils lashed out, the floor heaved and buckled, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Sarah was struck across the shoulder, sending her sprawling to the ground. Rachel pulled her back to her feet, shielding her from another attack. Danny and Marcus worked in tandem, their strikes precise and relentless. One by one, the cords fell, each severance accompanied by a piercing wail that rattled their bones. When the final cord was cut, the heart collapsed to the floor with a sickening squelch. For a moment, the chamber was silent, save for their ragged breaths. The green light dimmed, and the tendrils froze mid-movement before retreating into the walls. It was as if the entire system had shut down, leaving only the faint sound of dripping liquid. But the reprieve was short-lived. The floor beneath them began to quake violently, splitting apart to reveal a glowing abyss below. The walls groaned as cracks spread like veins, and the pulsating green light returned, brighter and more erratic than before. "It's destabilizing," Marcus shouted, grabbing his camera. "We gotta get out of here now." Danny led the charge toward a narrow opening that had appeared in the chaos. The group scrambled through the shifting chamber, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. They barely made it through the passage before the floor gave way entirely, swallowing the heart and its supports into the abyss. The tunnel they emerged into was eerily quiet, the only sound their labored breathing and the faint echoes of the collapsing chamber behind them. The walls here were smoother, devoid of the pulsating growths that had plagued the previous rooms. The green light was gone, replaced by a faint, natural luminescence that gave them their first sense of relief in hours. Sarah leaned against the wall, clutching her injured shoulder. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Danny shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet. That was just one part of it. We've disrupted its control system, but this thing is far from dead." Rachel pointed down the tunnel, where a faint breeze signaled the possibility of an exit. "We keep moving. If we stop now, it'll regroup, and we won't survive another encounter." The group pushed forward, battered but alive. The creature's breathing had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that hung heavy in the air. They knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, hope glimmered on the horizon, a fragile thread in the labyrinth of terror they had yet to escape. The passage before them stretched into darkness, the faint breeze now carrying a pungent odor, a sickly, sweet smell that clung to the air like dampened cloth. The faint glow ahead gave the only clue of what lay beyond, an eerie, pale light that seemed too unnatural for the labyrinth they had just escaped. The tunnel had shifted again, its once rough surface now smooth and sterile, as if they had crossed into a different world entirely. Despite the disorienting calm, Danny felt the familiar weight of unease settle in his chest. The silence of the passage was unnerving, more so because they had come to expect the constant hum of life, the strange rhythms of the creature that had been stalking them. Now, it was as if all that remained was the residue of whatever had once been alive here. They moved forward slowly, the unease in the air gnawing at their patience. "It's too quiet," Sarah whispered, her voice low and cautious. "It's like we're not supposed to be here." Marcus, keeping the camera steady, was the first to respond. "We've been deeper into this place than anyone else ever dared to go," he said, his words hollow. "Nothing is supposed to be here, but it is." They walked on in silence for a few more minutes, each of them consumed by the weight of their thoughts. Rachel, always the most practical, was the first to break the tension. "Look, I don't care how quiet it is, we can't stop now. We need to find an exit. If there's a way out, we need to take it before that thing finds a way to repair itself." As they continued down the corridor, the temperature began to drop, each breath clouding in the air. The farther they walked, the colder it became, as if they had descended into the bowels of the earth itself. But there was something off about this cold. It wasn't the natural chill of deep caves, but something far more calculated, as if the environment itself was designed to sap their energy, to make them second-guess their every step. The pale light grew brighter as they neared what looked like a door at the end of the passage. It was massive, imposing, and wrought from some kind of blackened stone that shimmered faintly in the light. The door appeared ancient, its design alien to anything they had seen before. The more they stared at it, the more they felt a sense of dread, an inexplicable pressure that weighed on their shoulders. "Do you feel that?" Rachel asked, her eyes wide. "It's like it's watching us." Danny stopped just short of the door, his hand outstretched, but not yet touching the stone. "I don't think we should open it," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Something's not right." For a long moment, they stood there, undecided. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and each of them could feel the pull, the irresistible urge to go forward. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice a little more assured than he felt. "We've come this far. We're not going to turn back now." With a hesitant breath, he placed his hand on the cold stone door. To their surprise, it didn't resist. Instead, it slid open with a soft, otherworldly hiss, revealing what lay beyond. What they saw on the other side defied explanation. The room was vast, the ceiling stretching so high it disappeared into the darkness. The walls were lined with shelves, but the shelves were filled with objects that could not be described as anything they knew. Flesh-like formations that pulsated softly, as if they were alive. In the center of the room stood a large, glass tank, its contents illuminated by an unsettling, flickering light. Inside the tank, suspended in a viscous liquid, was a creature, half human, half animal, its body distorted and contorted in ways that made Sarah's stomach turn. It was neither alive nor dead, its chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate motions, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for them. This isn't possible," Rachel muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Danny took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the creature. "This was its origin," he said. "The thing we've been fighting. It started as something like this." Marcus raised his camera, a mix of fascination and horror overtaking him. "We're looking at the source," he said. "This is what the creature was before it became what it is now. Before it became the zoo," Sarah added, her voice shaking. "This place is not just alive. It was created." The group stood there for a long moment, the enormity of their discovery weighing down on them. The creature in the tank, alive in some unearthly way, seemed to be more than just a source of terror. It was a warning, a message. The zoo they had been navigating was just the surface of something far more intricate, a biological system far beyond their understanding. Suddenly, the air grew thicker, the temperature dropping even further. The walls began to hum, and the tank that held the creature began to vibrate. The lights flickered and then surged, casting wild shadows across the room. The creature's eyes, long since closed, snapped open. It was awake, and it was aware of them. Fear gripped them all as the creature began to move, its limbs twitching, slowly at first, then faster, as though it were testing the limits of its confinement. The hum of the room grew louder, a cacophony of sound that rattled their teeth. "We have to leave," Danny shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. But before they could turn to flee, the ground trembled violently beneath them. The walls began to close in, the shelves of pulsating, living flesh contracting with each passing second. The creature's eyes, now fully open, locked onto them, and a terrible screech echoed through the room. It was no longer just watching them. It was calling them. "Move!" Rachel screamed, pushing Danny toward the door. The walls were closing faster now, and the room was quickly becoming a tomb. The only option was to escape. But even as they fled, they could feel the creature's presence pressing in on them from all sides. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening thud, leaving them in the eerie silence of the passage once again. The escape had been narrow, but they were far from safe. Whatever they had unleashed in that room was not done with them yet. It had awoken something far darker than they had ever imagined, and they had just entered its domain. As they stumbled through the corridor, the echoes of the creature's screech reverberated in their minds. The sound, both deafening and chilling, seemed to linger in the air around them, crawling into their thoughts and feeding their dread. Each step they took felt heavier than the last, the oppressive silence of the zoo pressing in from all sides. Their senses, already heightened by the fear of what they had just encountered, were now tuned to every subtle noise. The soft drip of water, the far-off groan of metal, the faint rustle of something moving in the dark. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest it felt as though it might burst. She glanced over at Marcus, who was still holding the camera, though his usual enthusiasm was gone. His eyes, wide with panic, darted around them as if expecting the walls themselves to come alive. "Did you see its eyes?" he whispered, almost to himself. "It was alive, Rachel. That thing is not just a creature. It's something else. Something ancient." Rachel didn't respond immediately. She couldn't. Her mind was still trapped in the image of those eyes, so cold, so calculating. They were eyes that had seen far more than any living thing should. Eyes that spoke of something old and terrible, a creature that had transcended nature itself. The creature they had seen, the one suspended in that tank, wasn't simply an experiment gone wrong. It was something that had been carefully constructed, something designed to break the boundaries of life and death. Danny, his face pale but resolute, spoke next. "We have to keep moving. We've gone too deep into this place to turn back now." His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't just trying to reassure them. He was trying to reassure himself. They were in uncharted territory now, and even their most rational thoughts were beginning to crumble under the weight of the unknown. But it wasn't just the creature they had to worry about anymore. As they rounded another corner, they found themselves at the edge of a large open space. The floor here was cracked and uneven, the walls marred by strange symbols and markings that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And in the center of the space was something they hadn't expected to see, a massive cage, its bars rusted and decaying, but still strong. Inside, huddled in the far corner, was a group of figures. Humans. At least they had once been. They were dressed in the same tattered uniforms they had seen earlier, the ones worn by the zoo's previous staff. But now, these figures were little more than twisted shadows of what they had been, their bodies disfigured and hunched, their eyes glassy and vacant. The sight of them struck Rachel with a wave of nausea. She had thought they were alone down here, but now it was clear that they weren't. "They've been changed," Sarah murmured, taking a step back. Marcus, for once, lowered his camera, unable to capture what was before him. The scene was too grotesque, too far beyond the realm of anything he had ever imagined. "What happened to them?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rachel didn't have an answer. She only knew that whatever had happened to these people, whatever had been done to them, was somehow tied to the creature. The zoo itself was part of this sickening, twisted experiment, and it was becoming clear that the creature was not alone in its torment. There was something far worse at play, something far more insidious. The figures in the cage shifted, their heads turning in unison, their blank eyes fixed on the group. Then, as if on cue, they began to move toward the bars, their bodies jerking with unnatural haste. It wasn't the quick, fluid movement of animals. It was the stiff, spasmodic motion of something that had once been human, but had long since lost its humanity. The sight sent a chill through Rachel's spine. She had thought she had seen the worst of it in the tank, but this was something different. The people in the cage weren't just victims. They were part of something far larger, something that defied the natural order. Danny grabbed Sarah's arm, his voice low and urgent. "We need to get out of here. Now!" But it was too late. The walls trembled again, and a low growl rumbled from the depths of the zoo. It was a sound like no other they had heard, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. It was coming from everywhere. The creature, the one they had seen in the tank, was awake, and it was hunting them. In an instant, the cage door slammed open with a loud crash, and the figures began to move, charging toward them with surprising speed. The growl became a roar, and the ground beneath them seemed to shake with the force of it. There was no time to think, no time to react. The zoo was alive, its walls closing in, its inhabitants unleashed. Panic spread like wildfire. Sarah screamed, her legs faltering as she tried to run. But the creature was faster than she could ever have anticipated. It leapt from the shadows, its massive form emerging with terrifying precision. Its eyes glowed in the dark, and its jaws snapped hungrily, the air thick with the stench of decay. Rachel's heart raced as she pulled Sarah toward the far side of the room. "Keep moving," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the creature. But it was relentless, and its roar echoed in their ears, louder now, as though it were closing in from every angle. And then, just as they thought they could outrun it, the floor beneath them began to give way. The ground cracked open, a gaping fissure widening beneath their feet. With a deafening screech, the creature lunged forward, its claws slashing through the air. The last thing Rachel saw before she was swallowed by darkness was its eyes, fixed on her with an unblinking intensity. And then, the world went black. When Rachel regained consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the absence of sound. The deafening growl of the creature, the frantic pounding of her heart. Everything had vanished. Instead, there was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on her from all sides. Her head throbbed painfully, and she instinctively reached up to touch the back of her neck, feeling a wet, sticky warmth that sent a wave of dread through her. Blood. It was her blood. But as she slowly opened her eyes, trying to make sense of her surroundings, she realized something far more terrifying. She wasn't alone. Her limbs felt weak, her body stiff from the shock of the fall, and as she struggled to sit up, a rush of dizziness overwhelmed her. She blinked repeatedly, trying to focus on the dim shapes in the room. The walls were jagged and uneven, as though the ground itself had split open to swallow them whole. The air was thick with dust and the musty scent of decay, mingling with something more metallic, a faint, lingering scent that reminded her of blood. But it wasn't the smell that made her freeze. It was the realization that she wasn't alone. Sarah lay nearby, unconscious but still breathing. Marcus was a few feet away, his camera lying forgotten on the floor, its lens cracked. He was curled into a ball, his eyes wide open, unblinking, as though he hadn't moved at all. It was as though time had stopped for them, as though they had been left suspended in some kind of nightmare from which there was no waking. The room they were in appeared to be some sort of hidden chamber beneath the zoo. It was colder than the rest of the building, as though the walls themselves were absorbing the warmth, trapping any hope of comfort within them. But there was something else about the room, something that sent a deep, unsettling chill through Rachel's spine. The walls were lined with strange, unfamiliar markings, symbols she couldn't decipher, all scrawled in what appeared to be a dark, viscous substance. The marks seemed to pulse as she stared at them, as though they were alive. As she attempted to push herself to her feet, the floor beneath her groaned, a long, drawn-out creak that echoed through the silent chamber. Rachel paused, her breath catching in her throat. Something was wrong with this place. It wasn't just abandoned, it was intentional. This room had been built not just for storage or maintenance, but for something far more sinister. The thought alone made her stomach churn. She wasn't sure what she had expected when they fell through that hole in the ground, but this wasn't it. Suddenly, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft scraping, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She turned her head toward the far corner of the room. Her eyes narrowed, her pulse quickened. The shadows in the corner seemed to shift, as though something or someone was moving. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Her first instinct was to run, to grab Sarah and Marcus and escape whatever nightmare had descended upon them. But something in the back of her mind held her in place. This wasn't a normal zoo. This wasn't a normal place. There was something deeper at work here, and if they were going to survive, they had to understand what it was. "Marcus," she whispered hoarsely, shaking him gently. "Marcus, wake up." He didn't respond. His eyes remained wide open, but there was no recognition in them. No life. It was as though he was trapped in a waking stupor, his mind somewhere else, far removed from the reality around him. Panic gripped Rachel's chest. Was he still conscious, or had he been affected? Was it possible that whatever had happened to those people in the cage was now happening to him? Her thoughts were interrupted by a louder sound, a screech that echoed off the walls and vibrated through her bones. It was closer now, unmistakable, like nails scraping against glass, a sound of deep, maddening frustration. Then, there was a distinct thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement, slow, deliberate. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Turning back toward the corner, she saw it. A figure, just beyond the shadow's edge, standing still for a moment before it moved. It was too tall, its silhouette unnatural, its limbs too long, twisted in ways that defied human anatomy. Rachel's breath hitched as the figure stepped into the dim light. It was one of the zoo workers, only it was not human anymore. Its face was pale and bloated, with veins bulging grotesquely beneath the skin. It moved with jerky, mechanical motions, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. This was not a person. It was something else. It was a reminder that the zoo had not just been conducting experiments on animals. Rachel's instinct screamed at her to flee, to run as far as possible, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place by the terror that gripped her heart. The figure took a step toward them, its long, skeletal fingers scraping along the floor as it moved with an eerie grace. The closer it came, the more Rachel could see the remnants of what had once been a uniform. The zoo staff, or whatever they had become now, these twisted husks of people, were not just mindless, soulless monsters. They were victims, just like the others, just like Marcus. But now, they had a purpose. A low growl rumbled in the distance again, growing louder. The creature, the one they had seen earlier, was close. Rachel could hear it coming, its heavy, guttural breaths reverberating through the walls. And she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever had happened to the zoo workers had spread to them, too. They were all part of something more than an experiment, something more than any of them had ever understood. The zoo was a trap, and they were all part of the prey. "Sarah," Rachel whispered urgently, moving toward her friend. "We have to get out of here. Now." But as she looked down at Sarah's still form, something caught her eye, a glint, just under the corner of the room. It was a door, a small, rusted hatch that had been partially concealed in the shadow. It was a long shot, but it was the only option. If they were going to survive, they had to move fast. The creature and whatever else lurked in the zoo were closing in on them, and the only way out might be through that door. Rachel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on her chest. "Stay with me," she muttered under her breath, her resolve hardening. The door was their only hope. With shaking hands, she reached for Sarah, knowing full well that everything they had seen so far had been leading them to this moment. The moment where the truth would finally be uncovered, for better or for worse. Rachel's mind raced as she pulled Sarah toward the rusted hatch, the weight of the situation threatening to crush her resolve. The faint scraping sound from the corner of the room grew louder, the creature's presence unmistakable now. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second, as though the walls themselves were closing in, but Rachel couldn't afford to stop. They had no time to hesitate. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fumbled for the hatch, her hands slick with sweat and the blood that still stained her neck. The rusted metal groaned as she pried it open, a sound that reverberated through the silence of the chamber. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped, the world hanging suspended between her and the horrors closing in around her. Her hands were trembling as she reached for the ladder hidden beneath the hatch, a faint glimmer of hope flickering in her chest. If this was an escape route, it was their only chance. But the very thought of venturing further into the unknown sent a fresh wave of dread through her. What if it was worse down there? "Marcus," Rachel muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, wake up." But the man showed no signs of life. His eyes remained fixed and empty, staring blankly ahead. It was as though the spark of his humanity had been extinguished, leaving only a hollow shell behind. The realization that he was gone, truly gone, hit Rachel with the force of a sledgehammer. The man she had once known was no longer there, not in any real sense. What had happened to them? To him? She had seen the twisted figure from earlier, and now Marcus seemed to be on the verge of becoming one of those monsters. Without another word, Rachel hauled Sarah up, pulling her toward the hatch. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep the panic at bay. It felt as if the walls were closing in on them, suffocating them with the weight of some malevolent force. The growling from the creature in the shadows was closer now, unmistakable in its urgency. The zoo was not just a place. It was a cage, a prison designed for something far darker than the public could ever imagine. As Rachel descended the ladder, her heart pounded in her chest, her every instinct screaming at her to stop, to turn back. The depths below were suffocatingly dark, a stark contrast to the dim glow above them. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened in the zoo had been planned all along, a carefully orchestrated trap. It wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. It was deliberate. Whoever was behind this, whatever had been unleashed, had known exactly what they were doing, and they were still doing it. Her feet finally touched the cold, hard floor beneath the ladder, and she immediately pulled Sarah into the small corridor. It was barely wide enough for them to move side by side, the walls closing in around them like the jaws of some ancient predator. The air was thick with the stench of rot, of decay. There was something eerily familiar about it, but Rachel couldn't place it. She could only focus on the task at hand, getting away from the horror that lurked behind them. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became, like they were descending into the very bowels of the earth. She tried to steady her breath, but the panic was creeping back in, tightening its grip around her chest. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the twisted figure emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. The silence, once oppressive, now felt almost too quiet, a subtle but sinister absence that gnawed at her nerves. And then, just as Rachel thought they might finally be free of the nightmare, they reached a door. It was small and unremarkable, just another heavy metal door that led into the depths. But as she pressed her ear to the cold surface, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks, a muffled, guttural voice, faint but unmistakable. It was not a human voice. It was something else, something inhuman, something that sent chills down her spine. Rachel slowly pushed the door open, her pulse quickening. What she saw beyond it was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The room was massive, larger than the underground chamber they had just escaped. But it was not the size of the room that took her breath away. It was the contents within it. The walls were lined with tanks filled with water, filled with strange, writhing creatures. Creatures she recognized from the zoo, twisted and contorted into grotesque versions of their original forms. They were still alive, though barely. Some had limbs that were too long, others were fused together, and some were nothing more than an amalgamation of various species, an unsettling hybrid of animal and human, all under some kind of brutal experimentation. But that wasn't the worst part. As Rachel stepped forward, she realized that these creatures, these malformed, suffering beings, were not the only inhabitants of the room. There were more people, at least a dozen, but none of them were truly alive. They were like Marcus, hollow, mindless, their bodies shuffling mechanically from one corner to the other. It was as though they had been turned into something less than human, stripped of everything that made them who they once were. Rachel's stomach lurched, and she fought to suppress the bile rising in her throat. She understood now. The zoo, the strange disappearances, the secrecy, it was all part of a sickening experiment. A place where they had taken both human and animal life, twisted and warped them beyond recognition. And as Rachel stared into the eyes of the people who were still wandering aimlessly, she realized that they were no longer people at all. They were the zoo's final product, its real exhibit. In that moment, something in Rachel snapped. She was no longer running from fear. She was running from a reality that was so monstrous, so horrific, that she could hardly comprehend it. She couldn't let this continue. She wouldn't let it. "Sarah," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to stop this. Whatever they've done here, we need to destroy it. All of it." But Sarah didn't respond. Rachel turned to find her friend still unconscious in her arms, her body limp, her face pale. It was clear now. Sarah, too, had been affected by whatever dark force had taken hold of the zoo. They were all connected in ways they couldn't yet understand, but one thing was certain. They weren't getting out unless they stopped whatever had caused this twisted nightmare. And that meant facing the very thing they had tried to avoid. The door slammed shut behind her, and Rachel was left staring into the abyss. The air in the underground chamber was thick with a mixture of chemicals, rot, and something far worse, an unnameable, oppressive presence that clung to the walls. Rachel stood frozen, her eyes scanning the room of grotesque exhibits, half-formed creatures, and the hollowed remains of the zoo's former inhabitants. The dim light flickering from overhead cast long, distorted shadows, making the room feel even more suffocating. Sarah, still unconscious, lay limp in her arms. It was only now, as Rachel stood amidst the horror, that the full scope of what had happened here began to sink in. She had always believed that zoos were places where the wild could be contained, studied, and understood, but this was not a place of study. This was a place of exploitation. Rachel realized with a sickening clarity that the zoo had not been a sanctuary for animals. It had been a laboratory, a breeding ground for twisted experiments that blurred the line between species, between life and death, between humanity and monstrosity. Every exhibit, every cage, was a testament to the horrific lengths to which these faceless people had gone in their pursuit of something beyond knowledge, something far darker. As Rachel looked at the creatures in their tanks, some alive, others barely clinging to existence, she felt a sense of guilt gnaw at her. These beings, these tortured creatures, had once been innocent. She had seen the animals they had once been, the lions, the tigers, the bears. But now, there was something else entirely. Their forms had been warped beyond recognition, twisted into monstrous parodies of themselves. And the people, humans who had been subjected to the same experiments, were no different. Marcus was just one of many, his humanity stripped from him until all that remained was an empty shell. What had they done to these poor souls? What had they become? Rachel's mind began to race as the grim realization settled in. This was not just a story of mad scientists or rogue experiments. No, this was something far more insidious. The zoo's operations were part of a much larger conspiracy, one that had been in motion for years. It wasn't just the animals and the people who had been experimented on. It was the entire system. The zoo had served as a front, a convenient way to divert attention away from the true horrors happening beneath the surface. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the tip of a much larger, far-reaching iceberg. Her thoughts were interrupted by a low groan coming from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, She wondered if one of the twisted creatures had come to life. Perhaps one of the half-dead things that had once been human. But when she looked closely, her breath caught in her chest. It was Sarah. Sarah's eyes flickered open, her pupils dilated and unfocused. She blinked several times, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but there was a blankness to her expression that made Rachel's stomach tighten. Sarah had been unconscious for hours. Had whatever had taken place in this place already begun to affect her? Was it too late? Rachel felt a surge of panic, her heart hammering in her chest as she knelt beside her friend. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Her body twitched slightly, as though she was struggling to regain control over herself. Rachel held her breath, watching in desperate anticipation. And then, slowly, Sarah's lips parted. "Rachel," she muttered, her voice hollow and distant. "They're watching. It's too late. We're already part of it." The word struck Rachel like a slap to the face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes finally focused on Rachel, but there was an eerie stillness in them, as if the person who had once been her best friend was slipping further away with each passing second. "You don't understand, Rachel," Sarah whispered hoarsely. "They're already in us. It's what they wanted. We were never meant to leave." A chill crawled up Rachel's spine, and she felt her stomach twist in knots. What did Sarah mean? What had they done to them? The sense of dread that had been building inside Rachel reached a fever pitch as the weight of Sarah's words took root in her mind. It was impossible to deny that something far darker than mere scientific experimentation had been at play here. But the idea that she and Sarah, both of them, had somehow become part of the experiment, part of the larger, twisted system, was a concept Rachel couldn't fully process. For a moment, Rachel was paralyzed, unsure of what to do next. Should they try to escape? Should they continue deeper into the underground chambers and confront whatever was pulling the strings behind this nightmare? Or had they already become part of something larger than themselves, a cog in a machine that was far beyond their comprehension? Before Rachel could gather her thoughts, a noise interrupted her, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound coming from behind one of the metal doors. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but as it grew louder, it became unmistakable, a slow, deliberate knocking. Someone or something was out there. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what lay beyond it, but there was no turning back now. The truth of the zoo, the experiments, Sarah's cryptic words, they all pointed to something that was only just beginning to reveal itself. As Rachel opened the door, she was met with a stark, blinding light. She squinted, her eyes adjusting to the sudden change in brightness, and then froze in place. Before her stood another figure. This one, however, was neither a twisted creature nor an unfortunate victim. It was a person, standing tall and composed, dressed in a lab coat stained with the same blood that now soaked Rachel's clothes. "Ah, you're awake," the figure said, its voice smooth and calculating. "We've been waiting for you." Rachel's blood ran cold. The zoo was no longer the place of confinement she had thought it to be. It was the hub of a dark and twisted experiment, one that was about to come to its final, horrifying conclusion. The figure standing before Rachel and Sarah was neither comforting nor familiar. Its face, obscured by shadows, was the last thing Rachel wanted to see. She felt an instinctive shiver crawl up her spine as the man, or woman, stared at her with an air of calculated interest, as if they had been anticipating this moment for years. The bright light from the chamber above gleamed on the figure's lab coat, revealing stains that Rachel could only assume were blood. But it wasn't just the gore that unsettled her. It was the way the person stood, composed, calm, as though they were not just in control, but had orchestrated everything that had led them here. "Waiting for us?" Rachel managed to whisper, her voice hoarse, disbelief creeping into her words. "What do you mean?" The figure stepped closer, the click of their shoes echoing unnervingly through the cold, concrete room. "Waiting for you and your friend," they replied, their voice smooth, almost patronizing. "You were both part of the plan all along. You see, this zoo was never just a zoo. It was a test, A breeding ground, if you will. Rachel's pulse quickened as the implications of the words settled in her mind. This place had never been a sanctuary for animals. It had never been about conservation or even research. This was an arena for something far darker, something that began with control and ended in something Rachel couldn't fully comprehend yet. What? What are you talking about? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She was still disoriented, her earlier clarity seemingly lost in the confusion and terror of the moment. Rachel could barely hold her together, but she forced herself to stay focused, to hold on to whatever thread of sanity was left. They needed answers, and this person might hold the key. The figure's lips curled into a faint smile, but it was not kind. It was a smile of superiority, as though they were indulging in a private joke at their expense. You've already witnessed the beginning of the experiment, they said. The transformations, the genetic manipulation, the merging of species, the corruption of both man and beast. All of it was necessary for the final stage. But you, Rachel, Sarah, you're the culmination. You are the bridge between two worlds, the final link in a chain that will change everything. Rachel's mind reeled. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream at this person, to tell them they were insane. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the work of madness. It was the work of a mind far too composed, far too systematic. Every step of the zoo's operations, from the mysterious disappearances of staff to the abnormal animal behavior, had led to this revelation. But why them? Why had she and Sarah been singled out for such a grotesque purpose? Why us? Rachel asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to maintain control. Why did you bring us here? What do you want from us? The figure's eyes gleamed as they took another step forward, their gaze fixated on Rachel. You were always going to be part of it, they explained. From the moment you entered this zoo, you were chosen. The experiments were meant to produce something unique, something transcendent. Sarah's symptoms, your connection to her. These were the signs, the signals that you two were the perfect candidates. The final phase of our work is almost complete. But you, they paused, the smile stretching unervingly wide. You are the key. Rachel's stomach lurched. What do you mean, the key? The figure took a deep breath, almost savoring the tension in the air. You see, they continued, all these creatures, both human and animal, were part of a greater vision. The merger of life forms, the creation of a new being that could exist across both worlds. The experiment was meant to bridge the gap between man and nature, to create a species with the strength of the beasts and the intelligence of humans. But it required a catalyst, and you two were always meant to be it. The weight of their words hit Rachel like a slap. This wasn't just about creating monstrosities or twisted creatures for their own sake. No, this was about creating something entirely new, something that could surpass the natural order, something that could change everything. Rachel wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her body numb with disbelief. But why animals? Why the zoo? Sarah's voice was faint but clear now, a flicker of understanding beginning to cross her face. The figure tilted their head, as though considering the question carefully. The zoo was the perfect place. We could manipulate the environment, isolate subjects, and ensure that their transformations remained undetected. It allowed us to collect the necessary data that you two will help us complete. The final process requires volunteers. The transition cannot happen without full participation, a willing sacrifice, if you will. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Sacrifice? You want us to? Not sacrifice, Rachel. Transformation, the figure corrected smoothly. You see, you've already been exposed to the changes. Your biology, your DNA, it's beginning to adjust. You've been marked for the final experiment. This zoo, this sanctuary, this hellhole, it was merely the staging ground. The next phase, the one that will transcend the limitations of human and animal, begins here. And you will both be the vessels for the final product. Rachel struggled to stay on her feet as her body trembled. She felt the walls closing in, the room growing colder, darker with each word the figure spoke. This wasn't just a zoo. It was a breeding ground for an abomination. A place where humanity was sacrificed for the sake of something far more terrifying. The idea that Sarah and she were part of this twisted vision, that they had been chosen for this fate, sent a chill straight through her. But there was more, something Rachel could not fully comprehend. There was something deeply personal about the figure's words. The way they spoke as though their involvement with the experiment was not just that of a scientist, but a creator. They had not only manipulated the zoo, the creatures, and the people, they had orchestrated every last detail. "Who are you?" Rachel demanded, her voice raw with emotion. "Who do you think you are to do this? To turn everything into this nightmare?" The figure's smile returned, but this time it was different, dark, almost satisfied. "I am the architect of the future," they said softly. "And you, Rachel, Sarah, you will help me usher in a new world. A world where humanity's limits no longer apply." And with those words, Rachel knew she and Sarah were not just prisoners in this twisted zoo. They were pawns in a much larger game, one whose end had already been written. They were no longer human, no longer animals. They were something new, something terrifying. And there was no escape from what was coming next. Rachel's heart pounded relentlessly in her chest as the figure's words reverberated through her mind, their meaning settling in like a weight she could not escape. She could hardly process what had just been said. A new world? Transcending the limits of humanity? These were not the words of a scientist or a madman. They were the words of someone who believed they had the right to reshape the world according to their vision, to decide what humanity would become. And the horrifying part was, they saw Rachel and Sarah not as victims or experiments, but as catalysts, the essential pieces in this grotesque puzzle. Sarah had gone completely still, her body frozen in a state of shock. Rachel could hear her shallow breathing beside her, but her friends seemed distant, as if struggling to come to terms with the enormity of their situation. Rachel wanted to reach out to her, to offer some kind of reassurance, but the chill in the air and the heavy weight of impending doom suffocated her words. She felt trapped, surrounded by an invisible force that no amount of logic or reason could break. "Please," Sarah whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "Tell me this isn't real. Tell me this is some nightmare, some sick joke." But Rachel knew it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a nightmare either. What the figure had said was true, and every fiber of her being told her that the nightmare was just beginning. They had both been manipulated, their fates tied together in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. There was no turning back from this, no simple escape. Their bodies, their minds, everything about them was part of the experiment, and the final transformation was already underway. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of who they would become. "You're not the only ones," the figure continued, their voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "There are others, other volunteers, other subjects. But you two are special. You're the final pieces of the puzzle. Your bond, your connection to each other, is what will make the transition possible." Rachel's stomach churned. Their bond? What did that mean? Was it just the years of friendship? Or was there something deeper, something more sinister at play? The more the figure spoke, the less sense things made. It felt like every layer of reality she had known was peeling away, revealing something grotesque beneath. "How do we end up here?" Rachel asked, her voice cracking under the weight of her disbelief. "Why us? Why me and Sarah?" The figure took a step closer, their eyes glinting with what Rachel could only describe as fascination. "It was always meant to be you two. From the very beginning. You, Rachel, were chosen because of your resilience. You survived the worst of what the zoo could throw at you, didn't you? And Sarah, well, she was always marked by something different, something unique. Her symptoms, her connection to you, to the environment here. It's what made you both perfect for the final phase." Rachel felt a surge of panic as her mind raced. There were things she couldn't understand, things that went beyond the logic of what was happening in this twisted zoo. The sickness that had begun to take root in Sarah's body, the strange shifts in her behavior, the unnatural force that seemed to have gripped her, was all part of the design. Sarah wasn't just a victim of this place. She was an instrument, a critical part of whatever monstrous change was about to unfold. "What is the final phase?" Sarah asked, her voice raw with emotion. "What happens next?" The figure's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile. The final phase is the transformation, the joining of your two essences into something greater. You will both become one with the creatures of this zoo, taking the best of what humanity and animal kind have to offer. No longer bound by the limitations of your previous lives, you will become something transcendent, something immortal. Immortal. The word echoed in Rachel's mind, haunting her. She had spent her entire life fearing the loss of it, only to be told now that she would be forced to transcend it, to become something neither fully human nor fully animal. Something new, something beyond the laws of nature, a grotesque abomination in the eyes of everything she once held sacred. But as much as she feared it, there was a strange pull in the figure's words, a sense of inevitability that dragged at her consciousness. This wasn't just about becoming something new. It was about becoming the architect of that new world. It was about choosing whether to embrace this grotesque new existence or resist it, if resistance was even possible. But what was left to fight against? The zoo, the creatures, the people who had orchestrated it all. How could she fight against something so all-encompassing? Rachel turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with desperation. "We can't let this happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to find a way out. We have to stop this." But Sarah just stood there, her eyes blank, staring into the void. It was as though she had already given up, as though, in her mind, the choice had already been made. "You can't stop it," the figure said, their voice colder now, almost final. "The process has already begun, but you do have a choice. You can choose to embrace the transformation, to be part of the future, or you can choose to reject it, but that will come with consequences." Rachel's heart sank. The figure was offering them a choice, but it wasn't a choice at all. It was an ultimatum, one that carried with it the weight of their fates. She could already feel the effects of the transformation stirring deep within her, the unnatural sensations beginning to take root in her body. She could see it in Sarah's eyes, too. Something had changed. The infection, the mutation, it was taking hold. "What's the alternative?" Rachel asked, barely able to steady her voice. "If we reject it?" The figure's smile widened. "The alternative? There is no alternative. Rejection means death. The transformation is the only way forward, the only way to survive." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Death. The finality of it hit her like a punch to the gut. If they rejected the transformation, they would die. It was as simple and cruel as that. But if they accepted, if they gave in, they would become something else, something inhuman. They would become the monsters they had been trying to escape from all this time. The thought of it sickened her to her core. In the silence that followed, Rachel's mind raced. She was faced with a choice, one that would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone. There was no easy answer, no comfort in either path. But she could feel time slipping away, the decision pressing down on her like an immovable weight. She had to make her choice, and whatever she chose, there would be no going back. Rachel's mind spun in turmoil as the figure's words echoed through her consciousness, and the oppressive weight of their meaning settled in deeper. The reality of the situation had never been clearer, yet the complexity of what lay ahead paralyzed her. The choice was no longer between escape or survival. It was a question of identity, a question of whether she would still be Rachel, the woman who once laughed with friends, fought to survive, and dreamed of a life beyond the horrors of the zoo. What did it mean to embrace the transformation? What was left of her humanity in a world where even death had been redefined? But as the seconds ticked by, the silence between her and Sarah grew increasingly unbearable. Sarah had already resigned herself to something, a fate, perhaps, but what did it mean for Rachel? Was she ready to sacrifice everything she had ever known? Her memories, her relationships, her self-identity? What would she become in the face of an all-consuming transformation? The figure in front of them seemed to radiate a sense of knowing, as if they could see right through Rachel, could feel her hesitation, her indecision. They had no fear. They knew that, in time, even the most defiant would bow to the reality of what was being offered. "You'll come to understand," the figure murmured, almost as though speaking to themselves. "The transformation is not just survival. It is evolution. a chance to step beyond the boundaries of your mortal existence. Rachel's stomach twisted with a sense of dread, but beneath it, something else stirred, a curiosity, almost a sick fascination. What did evolution mean in this context? To become something more or something less? The words of the figure began to haunt her, replaying like a broken record. Could she truly deny what had already begun to take root within her? Could she stand against the tide of change that was sweeping through her, altering her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend? The silence between her and Sarah was suffocating, but Sarah's distant gaze was now fixed on the figure, her expression unreadable. Was she already resigned to their fate? Rachel didn't know anymore. Sarah had always been the stronger one between them. But now, in this nightmare of twisted possibilities, she seemed as though she had given up on the very idea of humanity. The infection, the transformation, was already inside her. Rachel could see the subtle changes, the unnatural glow in Sarah's eyes, the stiffness in her posture that hadn't been there before. Something was happening to her, and Rachel knew it was only a matter of time before she, too, would no longer recognize her best friend. "What do you want from us?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. She knew that there was no turning back. The figure had already made it clear that their time was running out. She could feel it in her own body, the creeping sensation, the strange pull, the beginning of something that was not entirely her own. But she needed to know. She needed to understand the full scope of their twisted plan before she made the choice that would seal their fates. The figure smiled, but it was not a comforting smile. It was a smile of superiority, of absolute certainty. "What I want from you," they began, "is what all great creators want from their creations. I want you to embrace the next step in your evolution. You are the final link between two worlds, the human world and the world of creatures, of predators and prey. You are what will bridge the gap between the known and the unknown, between life as you have known it and life as it will become." Rachel recoiled slightly at the figure's words. The idea of becoming a link between two worlds, two forces that had always been kept apart, made her skin crawl. What was being offered wasn't just a transformation. It was the destruction of everything that had ever made her human. The more the figure spoke, the less she felt like she was part of the conversation. They were talking about her, but not to her. She was merely a pawn in their game, a subject to be molded into whatever shape they needed her to take. "We are not your creations," Rachel snapped, her voice shaking but determined. "We're not your experiments. We're not some test subject for your sick vision of the future." She took a step forward, though her legs felt weak, as if the weight of their predicament was pulling her down. But she couldn't back away. She couldn't give in to fear. Not now. Not when the world was spinning so wildly around her. The figure's face remained cold, unflinching. "You misunderstand," they said with a sigh. "You are not just any creation. You are chosen to be part of something greater. A new world is coming, and you, Rachel, you have the chance to be a pioneer. Don't you want to be a part of that? To transcend the limitations of this fleeting, fragile human existence." The figure's voice was hypnotic, almost soothing, but Rachel could sense the malice beneath it. She could feel the danger that came with surrendering to such a powerful, all-encompassing idea. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not without a fight. The idea of transcending, of leaving behind everything that made her human, was terrifying. But what terrified her even more was the thought of being swallowed up by the zoo. The place that had shaped them, twisted them, and now threatened to consume them entirely. "I won't become what you want," Rachel said through clenched teeth, her hands trembling at her sides. "You can't make me. This is wrong. Everything about this is wrong." The figure tilted their head, almost with pity. "You think you have a choice. But what you don't understand is that you already are becoming what I want. It is already happening, Rachel. The transformation is already in motion. You cannot outrun it. You cannot stop it." Rachel's breath hitched as the full realization of the figure's words settled in. She had been too late. The transformation had already started. The infection had already spread through her body. She could feel the changes now, slow, insidious, crawling beneath her skin. But there was something else, something deeper than fear. There was an awakening within her, a pull toward the inevitable. It was as though she had no choice but to embrace what was happening, to surrender to the process. In that moment, Rachel knew that her fight wasn't with the figure in front of her. It wasn't with the zoo or the monstrous transformation they were trying to force on her. Her fight was with herself, with the growing desire to resist and the undeniable truth that she had already begun to lose the battle. Her thoughts blurred together as she found herself standing at the edge of something far more terrifying than the horrors of the zoo. She had no idea what she would become, but deep down, she knew there was no going back. And somehow, that was the most terrifying part of all. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on Rachel, crushing her will to resist. The transformation had already begun, and in that moment, Rachel understood that she had underestimated the depth of her entrapment. The idea of escape, of returning to the life she once knew, seemed like an impossibility now. No longer could she deny the gnawing sense of inevitability that had rooted itself within her. The infection had spread further than she realized, creeping into her bones, twisting her thoughts, and pulling her deeper into the fold of the zoo's insidious grip. But there was still something left within Rachel, an ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She wasn't ready to let go of herself. Not yet. Despite the overwhelming pressure to succumb, she clung to the shred of humanity that remained. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. This was about everyone in the zoo, everyone who had been twisted by the same force that sought to consume her. And she wasn't willing to let it win. Sarah, too, had fallen under the weight of the zoo's influence, though it was far more subtle in her case. Her eyes had changed, lost that familiar warmth Rachel once saw in them. It was as though Sarah had already crossed over to the other side, her mind now clouded by the same force that had begun to pull Rachel into its grip. She wasn't Sarah anymore. She was something else, something far less human. It hurt Rachel to see this transformation in her best friend, but it was also a cruel reminder of the danger they were facing. Sarah had been so strong in the beginning, but now Rachel could see the cracks in her resolve. They both had been wearing thin, each trapped in their own personal battle with what was happening to them. Sarah had accepted the transformation in a way that Rachel couldn't, and that frightened her more than anything else. What did it mean for Rachel if she, too, began to slip into that same acceptance? The zoo had always been a place of captivity, of unnatural confinement. But now, it was clear that the bars weren't just physical. They were mental and spiritual, too. The zoo wasn't merely a structure of cages and exhibits. It was a framework for control, for shaping lives in ways that defied nature. It molded its inhabitants, carving them into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. And Rachel wasn't sure if there was a way to fight back against that kind of force. As the days blurred together in the twisted rhythm of their existence, Rachel found herself growing more and more distant from the person she once was. The lines between what was real and what was fabricated by the zoo began to fade. What had been familiar now felt like a distant dream. The people she had once known, the places she had once loved, all seemed to belong to another lifetime, one that was fading fast in the wake of her transformation. Despite this, Rachel still held on to the thought of escape. She didn't know what it would look like, didn't know if it was even possible, but the idea of staying in the zoo, of giving in to whatever twisted version of herself was being cultivated, seemed far more unbearable. There had to be another way. There had to be some kind of solution that didn't require her to surrender to whatever grotesque thing the zoo wanted her to become. One evening, as Rachel walked through the familiar path near the animal enclosures, a sudden sensation gripped her chest. A sharp, piercing pain spread through her limbs, and she staggered, clutching at the railing for support. The change had never been so physical before, never so immediate. It was as though something had just shifted within her, as though the transformation had reached its crescendo. A momentary panic surged within her, but it was quickly followed by an unsettling calm. It wasn't fear she felt now, it was acceptance. The shift inside her body had, for a fleeting moment, made her feel something else entirely. She wasn't just Rachel anymore. She could feel the presence of something else inside her. And for the first time, it felt familiar, almost comforting. But the comfort was fleeting. A deep sense of dread began to gnaw at her again. It wasn't her transformation that frightened her, but the realization that she was losing herself in the process. Every time she allowed the zoo's influence to take root, she moved further away from who she had once been. How could she fight against something that was so insidious, so deeply embedded within her? How could she fight when it was no longer just outside forces at play, but a war within her own body? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement behind her. She turned, half expecting to see Sarah, but what she saw instead sent a chill down her spine. The figure, whose presence had loomed over them for what felt like an eternity, was standing just outside the gate. Their face, shadowed in the dim light, held the same knowing expression Rachel had seen earlier. They seemed to watch her with a mixture of patience and expectation, as if Rachel were a part of a larger puzzle they were assembling. "You feel it, don't you?" the figure said, their voice barely more than a whisper carried on the wind. "The transformation has already begun. There's no going back now. You're closer than you realize." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "I haven't given up yet," she said, the words almost feeling like a lie as they left her lips. "I'm still fighting. I'm not going to let you win." The figure stepped forward, their movement smooth and almost predatory. "Winning is not the goal. We do not win, Rachel. We simply evolve. You are evolving, whether you fight or not." Rachel's chest tightened, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface came rushing to the forefront. She wasn't just a victim of the zoo. She was becoming part of it. She was being redefined, molded into something that no longer resembled the woman who had once walked in freedom. The figure was right about one thing. There was no going back. She could feel the weight of the inevitable pressing down on her with every breath. But in that moment, as she stood there, gazing into the figure's eyes, something shifted within her. She couldn't explain it, but she felt a flicker of resistance, something deep inside her that refused to accept this fate. For all the power that the zoo and its agents wielded, for all the manipulation, the one thing they couldn't take from her was the will to fight. And that was something she would never surrender, no matter what they turned her into. Rachel had come to a critical point in her struggle, one that seemed as though it would determine the course of the rest of her existence. The presence of the figure, that ever-watchful figure who had been guiding her steps along this dark path, had become more than just an ominous specter. It was a reminder that the transformation she feared and resisted had already begun. Every part of her, from the thoughts swirling in her mind to the sensations coursing through her body, felt foreign. The essence of who she had once been was slipping away. But in that moment of doubt and terror, Rachel made an unexpected realization. There was a distinct difference between change and destruction. The zoo, with its labyrinth of cages, strange animals, and whispers in the dark, had never been just a physical place. It was a psychological maze, one designed to force its inhabitants to confront not just their fears, but their very identity. Rachel now understood that the zoo wasn't trying to kill them, at least not in the way she had imagined. It wasn't about death. It was about remaking them. The zoo wanted to erase the distinction between the human and the animal, to dissolve any boundary between the two. She had spent so many weeks trying to find a way to escape, to undo the forces that were pulling at her soul. But escape, she now realized, was impossible. Not because of the physical barriers of the zoo, but because the transformation had already taken root inside her. The zoo was not an external force that could be fought with mere resistance. It was an internal one. To fight against it was to fight against the very core of who she was becoming. Rachel was no longer just a captive of the zoo. She was becoming part of it, and in that realization, the terror that had plagued her for so long began to dissipate. It wasn't that she had given up. Far from it. It was that she had stopped running from the inevitable. The battle wasn't over. It had just taken on a new form. If she was to survive this, if she was to have any semblance of herself left, she would need to stop fighting the transformation and instead learn to navigate it. The tension in her mind began to shift as she allowed herself to accept this new reality. It was not a defeat. It was simply another phase in the process. She had spent so long looking for the path out of the zoo, But perhaps it wasn't about finding an exit at all. Perhaps, she thought, the key to surviving this transformation was to understand it, to embrace the shift instead of seeing it as an end. The zoo, she realized, was about adaptation. It was about learning to live in this altered world, with the powers it held over her, while still holding on to the faintest trace of her humanity. She stood there in the darkness, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The figure, still standing just out of reach, had been watching her intently, as though waiting for her to arrive at this understanding. It was clear now that the zoo hadn't just wanted to break her. It had been testing her. Each decision, each moment of fear had been a trial. The real question now was what kind of person she would become when the transformation was complete. Would she resist the zoo's design and fight against what it sought to make of her? Or would she find a way to coexist with the creature she had once feared, to live in the new form she was being shaped into? The figure stepped closer, its eyes gleaming in the low light. "You've finally seen it, haven't you?" it asked, its voice smooth and almost soothing. "You're becoming something far more powerful than you realize. This is not a curse, Rachel. It's a gift." The words were meant to comfort, but they only added to the confusion swirling in her mind. A gift? The transformation wasn't a gift. It was a stripping away of everything she had once known. It was the loss of control, of freedom. It was the surrender of her identity. But as much as Rachel wanted to reject the figure's words, there was something deeply unsettling in them. Perhaps the zoo wasn't just trying to change her into a creature of the wild. Maybe it was trying to free her from the constraints of humanity altogether. "How many of you have come before me, trying to fight what's inevitable?" the figure continued. "And how many of you have failed? You think you're the first to try to escape? The first to fight the transformation? The first to rebel? You're not. But you may be the first to accept it." Rachel's mind raced. Was this the truth? Was this the key to surviving the zoo? If she could not escape it, could she still live within it, on its terms, yet with her own sense of self intact? She felt the tug of something deep inside her, an instinct that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. Perhaps the zoo had been preparing her for something. Maybe, just maybe, the very thing she had feared most, the surrender of her identity, was the answer to how she could survive. But even as this thought settled into her mind, Rachel felt a new wave of panic sweep over her. There was one thing she couldn't escape, something more powerful than any physical transformation. It was the memory of Sarah. Her friend, the one who had first walked beside her in the zoo, was now lost to it. Sarah had changed, given in fully to the zoo's pull. And now, Rachel had to wonder if there was any way to save her. If she could somehow find Sarah in the maze of cages, could she pull her back from the edge? Could Sarah still be saved? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of something stirring in the shadows. Something large, shifting, and moving toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the primal fear return, spreading through her veins. But instead of running, she stood her ground. The change had already begun, and in that moment, she knew she had a choice to make. She could either give in completely to the transformation or take what was left of her will and use it to confront the true horrors of the zoo. The moment stretched, and in that stretch, Rachel understood what was at stake. This was a final test. The zoo had already reshaped her, but there was still time to choose how to live within it. There was time, she realized, to fight in a new way. The last chapter of Rachel's ordeal in the zoo was not one of outward escape, nor was it one of a decisive battle fought between light and darkness. Instead, it was a confrontation with the very essence of her existence. The physical landscape of the zoo had shifted so dramatically, had become so alien, that it no longer mattered where she was or how she moved. The bars and cages had dissolved into the very air itself, and the path ahead, once filled with obstacles, now seemed to stretch endlessly into a world that was both unfamiliar and disturbingly familiar at once. Rachel stood in the center of the zoo, her body transformed, but her mind still grasping at remnants of who she had been. Her pulse quickened as she looked around, her senses heightened, sharper than they had ever been. She could hear the distant sounds of creatures moving, animals that were no longer confined to their enclosures, but were free to roam across the boundless wilderness of her new reality. The line between human and animal, between captive and free, had blurred. The zoo had become a mirror of her inner self, a reflection of the transformation that had slowly overtaken her. She thought back to everything she had endured, the nights filled with nightmares of shadows that moved on their own, the endless terror of the figure who had taunted her with its cryptic messages. The figure had been both her guide and her tormentor. It had forced her to see the truth, but not the whole truth. The zoo was not about domination. It was about freedom. Freedom from the constraints of normality, freedom from the limitations imposed by society, and freedom from the fear of what she was becoming. And yet, despite this revelation, Rachel still felt a profound sorrow. She was no longer the person she had once been, but even in her sorrow, there was strength. Strength in her acceptance of the transformation, strength in her ability to navigate this new world without resistance. Rachel had stopped fighting what she was becoming, stopped seeking an escape from the zoo's influence. In that surrender, she had found an unexpected peace. The zoo was no longer a prison, but a place of rebirth, where the boundaries of what was human and what was animal no longer applied. She had come to understand that she could not simply return to her old life. It was gone, irrevocably altered. The figure emerged from the shadows, its presence no longer looming with the same oppressive force it had once carried. It stood in front of her, no longer an entity of fear, but of understanding. "You've done it," it said softly, almost as if speaking to itself. "You've come to terms with what was always meant to be." Its voice was calm now, no longer mocking or threatening. Rachel could sense that it had been leading her all along, not toward destruction, but toward this moment of acceptance. The zoo doesn't change people. It reveals them. Rachel was silent for a long time, absorbing the weight of its words. The revelation was both simple and profound. The zoo had not been her enemy. It had been her mirror, reflecting the parts of herself that she had denied or been unwilling to face. She had resisted the darkness within her, the part of her that was wild and untamed, the part of her that feared losing control. The zoo had forced her to confront that darkness, to reconcile it with her humanity. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who had emerged stronger because of it. As the figure stepped closer, Rachel felt a strange warmth fill her chest. It was a warmth she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. It was the warmth of understanding, of connection, not only with herself, but with everything around her, the animals, the trees, the earth beneath her feet. The zoo had become her home, but it was not a place of confinement. It was a place where she had learned to shed her fear and her illusions of control. She was no longer just human. She was something more. "You are ready," the figure whispered, its voice like a breath against her ear. Rachel didn't ask what she was ready for. She knew. She knew that the final escape wasn't about leaving the zoo. It was about embracing the freedom it had offered her. The true escape was from the mental chains that had kept her trapped in a world of fear and uncertainty. The zoo had stripped those chains away, and now she was free to walk a path of her own choosing, with no fear of the unknown. With a deep breath, Rachel stepped forward into the heart of the zoo, where she felt the pulse of life vibrating in the air. Her heart no longer beat in frantic rhythms of fear. It beat steadily, in harmony with the world around her. The animals, once distant and unapproachable, now seemed to understand her, as though they recognized the shift in her spirit. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of the ecosystem, part of the untamed world that had once terrified her. As she walked deeper into the zoo, Rachel felt the weight of the transformation lift. She no longer felt divided between what she had been and what she had become. She was whole. She was free. The figure, having delivered its final message, vanished into the shadows, its purpose fulfilled. Rachel no longer needed its guidance. She had found her own way. And in that moment, as the world of the zoo unfolded before her, she knew that there was no going back. There was only forward. There was only life. And as she moved into the unknown, Rachel realized something that she had feared she would never understand. She had escaped. Not from the zoo, not from the forces that had sought to break her, but from the limits she had placed on herself. The zoo had not been her captor, it had been her liberator. It had shown her that true freedom was not about escape, but about transformation.